The most well-known tale about the beginning of languages, at least in areas where Judaism and Christianity are prevalent, is recorded in the Bible, specifically in Genesis 11, 1-9. According to the narrative, at one point in history, everyone who escaped the great flood caused by God's anger spoke the same language and settled in a place in the southern region of Mesopotamia called Shinar. As they settled and start building their lives there, the people believed it would be a good idea to begin construction on a skyscraper as tall as the heavens. However, God did not like this idea. Thus God cursed everyone working on the tower by making their speech incomprehensible to one another and distributed them all throughout the world. The city in which the tower was built was later named Babel. There is also a Hindu tale about the birth of languages. The story tells us that there was once a very tall tree that sprouted out of the earth's core. The tree was known as the world tree, or knowledge tree. The tree grew and grew to be nearly as tall as the heavens. Instead of stopping, the tree chose to keep growing so that its head would be in heaven and its branches would be on earth, allowing all humans to congregate under it and never separate. However, when Brahma, the god of creation, discovered the tree's plans, he punished the tree by cutting off all of its branches and scattering them all over the land. Where each branch fell, a new tree sprouted, bringing with it a new language and culture for humanity. In South Australia, a tribe in Encounter Bay tells a story about a very unpleasant elderly woman named Wururi. Wururi liked to walk with a broad stick in her hand, and for her own amusement, scatter the flames around the people who were sleeping. Wururi did not like to be around other people, and the feeling was apparently mutual, as no one liked Wururi. When Wururi eventually died, the people dispatched messengers in all parts to announce her death. Men, women, and children gathered not to weep, but to rejoice that they would never have to be disturbed by her aga. The Raminjera were the first to fall upon Wururi's corpse and begin eating her flesh. After eating her flesh, the Raminjera became the first people to speak clearly in a particular language. Later, other tribes started arriving and ate the contents of Wururi's intestines. This caused them to speak a slightly different language. The northern tribes arrived last and consumed Wururi's guts and anything else that remained. They then immediately started speaking a language that differed even more from that spoken by the Raminjera. Currently, more than half of the world's population is multilingual. Then there are polyglots, people who can speak at least 5 languages fluently, rather than just 1 or 2. This is not an anomaly, as the desire to be able to converse in several languages is as old as human history itself. In the ancient Near East, Akkadian was the language of diplomacy. Centuries later, it was Latin that became the main language of education, trade, religion, and government in much of Europe. In fact, about 2,000 years ago, learning Latin seemed to be the thing to do for one to advance. When the Romans governed a massive empire whose inhabitants spoke a variety of languages, many sought to acquire Latin as a second or third language. Therefore, those who were interested in learning Latin and had the means to do so would enroll in Latin classes where they studied Latin through textbooks and short dialogues about day-to-day life in Rome. Not unlike the materials used to teach foreign languages today, the Latin materials demonstrates how to use public baths, banks, markets, temples, and law courts, among many other things, as well giving students more exposure to the Latin language and the Roman culture. In addition to mastering grammar, Latin students would translate Latin texts into their native language and their native language into Latin text, a method that would later be known as the double translation method. Their reading materials included Virgil's Aeneid and Cicero's Catilinarian orations, although they would rarely got very far into the texts, depending on the level of skill they have in the language. When they have obtained enough vocabulary to read the text without a translation, they would then study monolingual Latin texts and decipher them using dictionaries and commentaries. they would then insert translations of the more difficult terms into their copies of the text. And like many modern learners, some ancient learners eventually went on to become fluent enough in Latin to be able to read texts without having to look up and note down difficult words. Latin was eventually surpassed by French, Italian, and English by the end of the 16th century, but the double translation method seemed to have remained, as the same method of language learning was said to have been used in the education of Queen Elizabeth I, who was herself a polyglot. She spoke English, French, Italian, Spanish, Greek, and Latin. Her tutor, Roger Ascham, helped Elizabeth perfect her classical languages through the double translation method. For example, Ascham would present Elizabeth with the original texts of Demosthenes or Cicero and have her translate them into English. After she completed this, he would then have her translate them back into their original languages. Later, Elizabeth would write translations and present them to her father, King Henry VIII, and his Queen Catherine Parr, in covers which she embroidered herself, as a way to show herself as a worthy daughter, deserving of her place in the royal succession, which was restored to her by the Act of Succession of 1544. The ancients show us that, although learning languages is difficult, it is far from impossible. In fact, language learning has always been required. The Roman poet Ovid, born in Sulmo, modern-day Sulmona, in L'Aquila, Abruzzo, Italy, was educated in rhetoric early in his life to eventually practice law. Following the death of his brother, Ovid renounced law and traveled to Athens, Asia Minor, and Sicily. With his life of scholarship and extensive travels, it is easy to imagine the necessity of Ovid being exposed to different languages. Later in his life as a poet, one can imagine Ovid being required to combine his creativity and knowledge of Greek to narrate such mythological situations in great detail in his Metamorphoses, which remains one of the most complete works on mythological stories to this day. Among some possible other languages that he would have been exposed to, Eupolemus, a Jewish historian and translator who lived in the 2nd century BC, spoke Hebrew and Greek, and gained fame by translating Hebrew works into Greek, making them more accessible to a wider audience. Plutarch rather beautifully alluded to the necessity of language learning in the ancient world, when he writes about the Athenian general Themistocles learning the Persian language for diplomacy. He writes in Life of Themistocles 29.5, King Xerxes gave Themistocles permission to say whatever he wanted about Greek matters. Themistocles replied that a person's speech was like a rich carpet whose patterns can only be seen when the carpet is spread out. When the carpet is folded up, the patterns are lost and hard to see. So, Themistocles asked for more time. The king liked the comparison, so he told Themistocles to take his time. Themistocles asked for a year. Then, when he had learned enough Persian, he talked to the king on his own. We also have an example of the necessity of learning another language for the purpose of education. Only a few educated Romans with antiquarian inclinations could read Etruscan at the time of its extinction. The last person known to have been able to read Etruscan was the Roman Emperor Claudius, 10 BC to 54 AD. Aspiring to be a historian in his youth, Claudius wrote a 20-volume treatise on the Etruscans called Tyrannica, as well as compiling a dictionary of the Etruscan language by interviewing the last few elderly Etruscan rustics who still spoke the language. Pliny the Elder, a Roman historian and author, described Mithridates VI, 135 to 63 BC, as the empire's most fearsome foe. Under him, the kingdom of Pontus, modern-day Turkey, fought and conquered the late Roman Republic in multiple battles. Although he eventually lost, Mithridates' reputation as one of the greatest polyglots of all time only grew over the years and centuries. In Volume 7 of his Natural History, Pliny noted that Mithridates, who ruled over 22 countries, could give a speech in every language he spoke, without the aid of an interpreter. on top of making a point of studying the languages of the peoples he reigned over in his large dominion, Mithridates seemed to have even went one step further, as he was also proficient in ancient Persian, even though his realm did not extend that far. Author Valerius Maximus, Latin grammarian Solinus, and author Aulus Gellius also confirmed that Mithridates was thoroughly conversant with the languages of all the nations over which his rule extended. Although, perhaps much like what modern polyglots would experience these days, some commentators have regarded Mithridates' language skills as an exaggeration, and others sought to diminish it, explaining that the languages he spoke was in fact different dialects rather than distinct languages. There does not appear to be any reason to doubt these caveats in the narrative of the contemporary writers. Pliny declares that Mithridates' language skill is quite certain, and the matter-of-fact tone in which the historians relate, it makes it clear that they wished to be understood literally by the readers. It was the king's practice, they tell us, to communicate with all the subjects of his diverse empire directly and in person, never through an interpreter. And Gellius affirms that Mithridates was able to converse in each and every one of these languages with as much correctness as if it were his native dialect. Egyptian Queen Cleopatra VII, 69 to 30 BC, could speak 9 languages, according to Plutarch, and rarely needed an interpreter for diplomatic purposes. Although her native language was Greek, she was known to also speak the Egyptian language perfectly, which was apparently a rare accolade for Egyptian rulers of the time. Plutarch calls Cleopatra's accomplishments very extraordinary, even though they fall far short of those of Mithridates. She spoke most languages, according to him, and only a small number of foreign ambassadors received an audience with her through an interpreter. The imposing list of languages that Cleopatra spoke, according to Plutarch, includes the languages of the Ethiopians, Troglodytes, Hebrews, Arabs, Syrians, Medes, and Persians. However, Plutarch also adds that this list does not comprise all the languages which Cleopatra understood. In Antony 27.4-5, Plutarch concluded that all these languages must have been heard on the streets of Alexandria in Cleopatra's day. Ethiopian would be Cush's native tongue, and Syriac is an Aramaic-based language. Troglodyte, which is possibly the ancestor of contemporary Beja, would have been spoken along the Red Sea coast. It is noticeable that there is no mention of Libyan or Latin, although Plutarch adds that Cleopatra is said to have spoken many other languages besides the ones he does mention. It was likely her amours with Caesar and later Antony were conducted in Greek, which would in turn tell us that both Julius Caesar and Antony could speak Greek as well as Latin, as well as both of them being comfortable enough with the Greek language to be able to romance the Egyptian queen. Cleopatra and Mithridates serve as very prominent examples of the necessity and possibility to learn other languages in the ancient world. However, there is the absence of allusion to any other polyglots in the ancient world, which might have implied that Cleopatra and Mithridates were the only 2 examples of polyglots, which is not the case. Valerius Maximus, in his De Studio et Industria, cites the case of Mithridates as a remarkable example of study and industry, as Valerius Maximus also cites Cato learning Greek in his old age, Themistocles learning Persian during his exile, and Publius mastering all 5 dialects of Greece during his praetorship. As examples of language learning, it is very likely that if Valerius Maximus knew of any other eminent linguists, he would have added their names on this little list. For his part, Aulus Gellius has no other notable linguist to present to us, as a contrast to Mithridates other than the old poet Ennius, who used to boast that he had 3 hearts, because he could speak Greek, Latin, and his own native dialect, Oscan. And Pliny, despite his love of parallels, is even more meager in the informing us of other possible polyglots or multilinguists in the ancient world, as he does not put forward a single name in comparison with that of Mithridates. Abu Nasr Muhammad al-Farabi, circa 872 to circa 951 AD, dedicated his life to spreading Aristotle's work to educated Arabic-speaking residents of the Islamic Empire. Although several of al-Farabi's major works have been lost in whole or in part, many of his publications explaining Aristotle's Organon, the collection of Aristotle's writings on logic and related themes, have survived, and the number of Western translations of them is rapidly increasing. Al-Farabi investigates the different functions of language in human life and society. He stresses the importance of language in conveying knowledge, asking questions and resolving arguments, and describing distinctions and classifications. He argues that language mimics meanings in some ways, and that mismatches between language and meanings must be avoided. He portrays Aristotle's logic as a set of techniques for persuasion, debate regulation, truth discovery, and certainty, all of which demand high levels of communication skill. He also investigates the use of logic and language in poetry. Along the way, he makes a number of insightful observations on topics ranging from the origins of metaphysical concerns to the temporal organization of events and the relationship between poetry and music. The extant works of al-Farabi contain well over 1,000 pages devoted to explaining the contents of Aristotle's logical teachings to educated Arabic readers. Much of this material demonstrates al-Farabi's interest in the nature of language. In addition to the Alexandrian material, al-Farabi also had access to very polished Arabic translations of the Organon's books. He also possessed translations of several Roman Empire logical writers, such as Alexander of Aphrodisias and Themistius, and he is not known to have used older Arabic literature on logic. In the 200 years since his death, al-Farabi's work on logic and language has had a direct impact on various Arabic authors, such as the Arab Andalusian polymath Ibn Bajjah, Avimpasi, Persian polymath Ibn Sina, Avicenna, Persian polymath al-Ghazali, Al-Ghazal, and Andalusian jurist Ibn Rushd, Averroes. He also had an impact on some medieval Jewish authors such as Maimonides. Al-Farabi's impact is evident in scholastic discussions of determinism, lyrical argument, and scientific classification, as well as possibly in ampliation. In various publications, al-Farabi examines aspects of Arabic as a language. Some of these writings include comparisons of Arabic to other languages, including Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Sogdian. Although there has been no narrative about al-Farabi's command of these languages, he has evidently gained some knowledge and given considerable thought towards them to be able to make educated comparisons between these languages and Arabic. Al-Farabi defines the evolution of a language inside a community. In his letters, he depicts a community whose members have ideas, makalt, which literally means intellected things, or intelligibles, that enable them to identify recognizable items in the external world, either individually or as types of thing. These notions derived from perception of the external world are referred to as basic concepts by him. These people have beliefs, and they can think about the world, consider their actions, and communicate by pointing. However, these people do not yet speak any language. This leads us to al-Farabi's theory that the first step towards language is when people understand that they can better convey their requirements to one another if they agree to name particular objects and concepts with vocal sounds. This then establishes a conventional association between simple notions and words, which eventually becomes accepted by the entire community. The words signify the notions with which they are associated. Al-Farabi envisions a lawmaker regulating the correlation and adding some words to it for the community's welfare. As a result, a national lexicon is formed, and the sounds employed constitute a national alphabet.